Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mighty Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 2, also known as Sha Lang by Priest, and we're covering the last 3 chapters in Arc 6, The Frost Endured, so that's going to be chapters 53 through 55. So, without further ado, I hope you all enjoy! Chapter 53, Détente. When Chang Geng had arrived at Gu Yuan's room, he had been perfectly self-possessed, as if the entire world lay in the palm of his hand. By the time he left, he had become a puddle of human-shaped goo. He had no idea how he managed to put one foot in front of the other on his way out. After an unexpected thaw, the temperature had plunged once again. Yet, in the chilly night air, his breath felt like a raging ball of fire burning in his chest. Chang Geng fled back to his own courtyard, heart racing. He exhaled heavily as he pressed his forehead against the sword training puppet standing by the courtyard's entrance. After so many years, this iron puppet was already very old. Chang Geng couldn't bear to continue using it as a sparring partner, so he had the servants leave it in the courtyard as a rather incongruous lantern stand. The frigid chill of the iron soon cooled Chang Geng's burning flesh. He tilted his head back to look up at the big fellow, and childhood memories washed over him. He remembered giving it a box full of pastries to carry every morning before the sky had lightened. The two of them, a boy and his automaton, bounding off to Gu Yuan's courtyard to listen to his godfather's rambling lectures. Then there was the time they celebrated Gu Yuan's birthday. They had trussed it up in a ridiculous outfit of silk and made it deliver an unappetizing bowl of noodles to Gu Yuan. A smile spread across Chang Geng's face unbidden as his mind wandered through the past. It seemed every one of his happy and warm memories had to do with Gu Yuan. Chang Geng held the lamp he carried on the iron puppet's outspread arm and gave the exposed gear protruding from the back of its neck a familiar pat. He thought back on Gu Yuan's words just now and sighed, his eyes growing dim. He had imagined Gu Yuan would either fly into a rage or persist in his efforts to counsel him. He never expected Gu Yuan to take this approach. Like the virtuous spring breeze and rain, Gu Yuan had gently made his position clear. I am still your Yifu. I am still the person who cares for you the most. No matter what you think, I will remain as before. I will forgive your transgressions and will not take your foolish words to heart. Though I cannot indulge your wild fantasies that run contrary to social order, I believe there will come a day when you will find your way back to the correct path. Chang Geng had emblazoned the words, I want for nothing, thus I am strong, unto himself, only for Gu Yuan to counter with, I stand steadfast and unmoved. He shows me so much consideration, Chang Geng thought, torn between laughter and tears. Why doesn't he spare a little for himself when facing that man in the imperial palace? Chang Geng knew why Gu Yuan had so abruptly dismissed him. It wasn't because he found him an eyesore. Rather, it was because he had more or less surmised what Chang Geng was about to say, and tactfully hinted for him to leave it unsaid. Certainly, in Gu Yuan's position, stepping back to avoid a fatal strike was the inferior course of action. It would be far simpler to rebel outright, force the Son of Heaven and his vassals to their knees, and consolidate military and political power in his own hands. On the surface, Gu Yuan was a scoundrel. But beneath this skin, steeped within the deadly resolve of his iron blood, lay a dignified and upright gentleman's bones. He was simply not capable of overthrowing his sovereign and usurping the throne. As Chang Geng stepped slowly into his room, the air was filled with a familiar flapping of birds' wings. He reached out and caught the battered wooden bird. Its open belly revealed a letter from Chen Qingxu, her handwriting so crabbed that Chang Geng struggled to decipher the words. I've tracked down the origin of the poison on the arrow that struck the marshal that year. If I can find the secret formula, I may be able to create the antidote. Chang Geng froze where he stood. Before triumphant exultation could surge through his heart, he saw there was more to Chen Qingxu's message. However, the Marquis's eyes and ears have suffered years of damage. He has also been treating poison with poison, and this, too, has accumulated over time. Poison can be neutralized, but grave illness is difficult to cure. Please prepare yourself, Your Highness. Finally, there was an even messier line scrawled at the bottom. I suspect this poison is one of the most closely guarded secrets of the barbarian goddess. The last goddess of the tribe married into the imperial harem. Tracking down more information beyond the border will be difficult. If convenient, you can try investigating in the palace. Chang Geng read the letter in full, then burned the scrap of paper to ash. His heart sank. The family of the Marquis of Anding had served in the army for generations and enjoyed the great favor of the emperor. The Marquis estate had likewise been specially bestowed. From within Chang Geng's little courtyard, one had only to lift their head to see the magnificent eaves of the imperial palace gleaming in the moonlight. Chang Geng glanced, perhaps unintentionally, in the direction of the palace, a tempest brewing in his eyes. That hair-raising glare lingered for but a flash, then disappeared without a trace. Bright and early the next morning, Guyuan dispatched a messenger to the palace to deliver a memorial bearing his plea for forgiveness, just as Chang Geng had suggested. First, he systematically delineated the results of his self-reflection and sincerely admitted his wrongs. Then, he declared that due to a flare-up of an old injury, it would be difficult for him to continue to bear such heavy responsibilities and requested that His Highness permanently revoke his seal of command. Claiming illness was a common pretext for evading one's duty, but the Marquis of Anding's memorial seemed more credible than most. He followed it up with a long note written in that famous calligraphic script of his, in which he laid out, in minute detail, all military affairs that needed to be handed over. Finally, he signed off with the bluntness of a cudgel by requesting His Majesty allow him to move the site of his confinement to the capital's outskirts. The most elegant brushstrokes in the world couldn't mask the meaning between these lines. I've done enough self-reflection. Now let me go out and play. The memorial brimmed with the Marquis of Anding's insouciant style and impudent practicality. It was obvious that it hadn't flowed from the pen of a ghostwriting advisor. The long-gone emperor held onto the memorial for a full day. The following morning, he bestowed on his subject a considerable quantity of rare and precious medicinal ingredients to express his special favor and repealed the decree imprisoning Guyuan to his residence, thereby tacitly accepting Guyuan's resignation. In order to maintain some semblance of harmony between ruler and subject, he did not appoint a new commander. He left the seal of command unassigned and offered warm words of solace, proclaiming his intention to return it once the Marquis of Anding recovered from illness and came back to court. That day, after his afternoon nap, Li Feng chanced upon a book he once read as a child. When he lifted it, a calligraphy sample note fluttered out from between its pages. Compared to the memorial sitting on his writing desk, the penmanship on the note was childish and clumsy, the turns of each stroke somewhat lacking in power. Yet one could already see the vigorous style into which it would one day develop. After examining the note for a long time, Li Feng sighed. "Do you know the author of this note?" he asked Zhu Xiaojiao. Zhu Xiaojiao feigned ignorance. This old servant does not know what constitutes good or poor calligraphy, but since your Majesty kept it, it must be the work of some renowned master. What a glib tongue you have! But we suppose he can indeed be considered a renowned master. This was written by Imperial Uncle Shi Liu. Li Feng placed the note carefully on the desk and smoothed it out with a paperweight. His eyes grew distant with thought. When we were young, we lacked the patience to practice calligraphy and were often scolded by our imperial father. When Uncle found out, he went home and stayed up the entire night. The next day, he gave us a stack of calligraphy sample notes he had written himself. Back then, Guyuan's eyesight was already poor during the day, and it was even more difficult for him during the hours of darkness. To see at all, he had to wear his glass monocle. After staying up all night, his eyes became so bloodshot he looked like a rabbit the next day. Yet he insisted on feigning nonchalance before others. As Li Feng spoke, he remembered those happy days of youth. He murmured nostalgic, "Uncle was so withdrawn as a child. He didn't like people getting close to him at all. He was the polar opposite of the way he is now." "Aye, that's right. Where is he now?" Zhu Xiaojiao responded respectfully. "I hear that he is convalescing at the hot spring villa in the northern outskirts." Li Feng was torn between laughter and tears. He really went out to play? He truly is carefree. Forget it. The spring tea from Jiangnan has just arrived. Have someone deliver him some to try. We'll ask him to inscribe a horizontal plaque for the Northern Imperial Residence later. Zhu Xiaojiao accepted the order and said no more. A light touch, he felt, was sufficient. That very afternoon, the Protectorate of the Northwest sent an urgent missive to the emperor. It reported the unusual movements of foreign forces beyond the pass, then detailed the Black Iron Battalion's refusal to heed the marching orders decree, their outrageous subsequent detention of Protector General Meng, and other various offenses. The long-gone emperor was still steeped in nostalgia over his childhood with Gu Yun. He made a grand show of displeasure, but the consequences he meted out were light. He instructed someone to reprimand He Ronghui for lack of regard for the nation's law and docked his salary. He then ordered the Black Iron Battalion to rigorously defend against any suspicious movements on the border. When Chang Geng finally eked out some free time, he made his way to the hot spring villa in the northern outskirts of the capital to inform Gu Yun of these developments. Upon arrival, he was greeted by the sight of that Gu bastard wrapped in a bathrobe with his feet soaking in a hot spring. With a wine glass in hand and a pair of lovely female attendants rubbing his shoulders and massaging his back, he looked so content he was on the verge of transcending the mortal plane. To think, when Gu Yun had said he was planning to convalesce, he'd actually go and do just that. The half-deaf man failed to hear Chang Geng's approach. He turned his head and said something to the girl beside him, and she smiled, her face reddening. Chang Geng was beyond words. Gu Yun found the attendant's blush quite cute and moved to touch her rosy cheeks, but just as he lifted his hand, he saw the girls hastily greet someone and spring up to withdraw. Gu Yun turned back and groped for his glass monocule, which he set on the bridge of his nose. When he saw Chang Geng, this old reprobate wasn't ashamed in the slightest. He gleefully called Chang Geng over and pushed himself languidly into a sitting position. "It's been ages since I relaxed like this. My bones are about to melt from lying around so much." "You sure they're not melting for some other reason?" Chang Geng regretted these words the instant they left his mouth. Gu Yun didn't seem to hear him, his face perplexed. "What was that?" Chang Geng at once remembered how, back when Gu Yun and Shen Yi had disguised themselves as impoverished hermits in Yanhui town, Gu the deaf and blind would wield his extraordinary talent of failing to hear anything that didn't please him. He was already an expert at playing the fool, so once he started up with his deafness, he was like a tiger that had sprouted its wings, more powerful than ever before. The Marquis of Order, greatest fool in the land, asked with great eagerness, "Oh, did you bring my medicine? I'll take you to the snowy plum blossom pavilion in the rear courtyard tonight. They've hired a few new songstresses over there. Apparently, they're all competing for the opening spot at the New Year's Eve performance at Kite's Flight Pavilion. We can get a sneak peek." Chang Geng had thought Gu Yun wanted him to bring the medicine because of some emergency he needed to attend to. After all this fuss, it turned out it was because he couldn't enjoy the company of beautiful women to the fullest if he couldn't hear. Chang Geng pasted an insincere smile on his face. "Every medicine is 3 parts poison. Seeing as Yifu has no urgent business at hand, you ought to take it less." Wonderful," Gu Yun responded nonsensically. "I'm glad you brought it. The water here is superb. You should come in and relax a while." Chang Geng was speechless. He gave up on trying to reason with Gu Yun. He sat solemnly beside the hot spring and didn't even look up as he lifted his hands and signed. "His Majesty has received a report from the Northwestern Front. You can rest assured, all is well." Gu Yun nodded slowly. Seeing as you're already here, Why not join me for a soak? I'll pass, said Chang Geng, face blank. You can enjoy it by yourself, Yifu. Tch. Guyuan clicked his tongue. He made no attempt to avoid Chang Geng's eyes as he calmly stripped out of his robe and slid into the water. Chang Geng, flustered, averted his gaze. With nowhere to rest his eyes, he haphazardly snatched up a wine glass and took a sip, as if trying to hide something. Only when the wine moistened his lips did he remember he was holding Gu Yuan's cup. He jerked to his feet so abruptly he nearly upended Gu Yuan's little table and said hoarsely, I just came to tell Yifu the news. Now that you know, I have to go back. I still have some business to attend to, so... Little Chang Geng. Gu Yuan called him to a stop. He removed the glass monocle, which had fogged in the steam, and set it aside. He could only see a dozen centimeters past his nose, and his eyes were unfocused. Yet he stood as regal as a flood-wielding dragon king. We're all men here, Gu Yuan said, careless. You have everything I have, and I don't have anything you lack. There's absolutely nothing to write home about. Chang Geng held his breath and finally lifted his gaze. Even with the mist of the spring blurring the lines of Gu Yuan's figure, the scars covering his body were shocking to behold. One slash began at his throat and sliced diagonally across his chest, as if his torso had been cleaved in two and sewn back together. Gu Yuan was an expert in human nature. He knew that with some things, the greater the taboo, the more intoxicating they became, and the more forbidden they seemed, the more difficult they were to give up. Thus, he might as well be magnanimous and allow Chang Geng to look as he pleased. Besides, it wasn't as if there was anything worth seeing. Everyone feels very deeply for their parents. You're not alone. I was like that too, Gu Yuan said. My father was a brute who sent iron puppets to chase and hack at me. The first person who held my hand and taught me to write was the late emperor. The first person who coaxed me to take my medicine and rewarded me with candied fruit was also the late emperor. As a child, I thought he was the only person who ever cared for me. Sometimes, when this kind of feeling grows too strong, it may lead to certain misconceptions. It's okay. It will fade with time. The more you dwell on these feelings, the more you will buckle under their weight, and the more they will plague you. Chang Geng opened his mouth to reply, but Gu Yuan made the most of his weak hearing. Unconcerned whether Chang Geng responded or not, he forged ahead on his own. Yifu knows you're a good kid, but you've got a bad habit of taking on too many mental burdens. Lay them down and stay here with me for a few days. What are you doing rubbing elbows with old monks all the time? There are so many marvelous sights in this world, and plenty of pleasurable diversions. Why stick to the same old beaten track? Chapter 54. A Sudden Disturbance. Chang Geng stood frozen for several seconds before walking over to the hot spring. He dropped slowly to his knees and stared at the ropes of scar tissue covering Gu Yuan's body. After so many years, he had grown accustomed to being startled awake by the wu-er-ge in the middle of the night. He would jerk back to consciousness, and then he would toss and turn, thinking of Gu Yuan. Chang Geng had preferred peace and quiet since childhood. He had often felt, in those days, that his overly energetic godfather defied reason. Later, after pondering over many sleepless nights, he was struck by a curious question. How did Gu Yuan grow into the person he was now? As the only child of the former Marquis of Anding and the eldest princess, he must have been an incomparably precious, insufferably arrogant noble young master. Yet, after losing his sight and hearing at such a young age, he had been driven forward under his own father's whip, beaten and reshaped like wrought iron, his unfledged wings riddled with scars. He lost 2 parents in rapid succession and, as the past glories of the Black Iron Battalion faded with time, was confined deep within the interior of the imperial palace. A person who has experienced so much pain as a child, even if they don't become withdrawn or volatile, at least oughtn't become someone so playful and mischievous. Chang Geng felt sure of this. He couldn't imagine how many layers of overlapping wounds it took to temper a person like Gu Yuan. Chang Geng suddenly hated that he was born 10 years too late to hold this person's young and clumsy hands amid the thicket of brambles and thorns. For that reason alone, he would envy Shunyi all his life. He reached forward as if possessed and brushed aside Gu Yuan's long hair, which draped over his shoulders and into the water. Then he carefully touched the scar that stretched across Gu Yuan's chest. Psst! How impudent! A prickling sensation shivered across Gu Yuan's scalp at the touch, and he hastily stepped back. I'm trying to reason with you here. What are you pawing at me for? How did you get this? Chang Geng asked, his voice hoarse. The deaf man didn't hear him. Chang Geng caught Gu Yuan's hand and wrote his question, word by word, into his palm. Gu Yuan blinked in surprise. His memory momentarily failed him. Chang Geng wiped away the condensation on Gu Yuan's glass monocule and set it back on his nose. He gazed deeply at Gu Yuan and signed, Yifu, let's take turns coming clean, okay? Gu Yuan had an ill-fated relationship with the words coming clean, so naturally, he wasn't okay with this at all. Chang Geng didn't give him a chance to demur. You cared deeply for the late emperor, but did you want to kiss him, embrace him, and entangle intimately with him your entire life? What? Gu Yuan blurted out. He couldn't help but recall the late emperor's withered face, which always seemed to overflow with misery. He promptly broke out in goose flesh. Very well. You've answered. So now it's my turn, Chang Geng said, his face ascetic as a monk's. I do. It was several seconds before Gu Yuan managed to digest the meaning of Chang Geng's I do. His previous wave of goose flesh had barely subsided before a second wave was upon him, all his hair standing on end like a hedgehog. I want it, at all hours of the day, even in my dreams, and I especially want it now. I also want other things. I'm afraid I'll sully Yifu's ears if I say them aloud, so I won't. Chang Geng closed his eyes and turned his face away from Gu Yuan. How could I have experienced a chi deviation if I weren't deeply and irrevocably entrenched in these feelings? After a lengthy silence, Gu Yuan finally said, rather stiffly, Perhaps you should go back to reading scripture with those monks. If only you had said that to me 5 years ago, Chang Geng said. Maybe if I'd let go then, we wouldn't have gotten to this point today. But so many days and nights had come and gone. So many nightmares and tribulations he had only endured by invoking Gu Yuan's name. He had been quenching his thirst with poison all this time, and it was far too late. The Marquis of Anding was struggling to keep up. After staring at Chang Geng in stupefaction for a good while, he thought to himself in consternation, 5 years ago, I still thought of you as a nursing infant. Next question. Chang Geng squeezed his eyes shut. Does Yifu find me disgusting? Gu Yuan once again fell silent. Chang Geng's lashes quivered violently, and his hands involuntarily balled into fists within his sleeves. Gu Yuan's physical reaction just now couldn't deceive him. His obvious discomfort was clear from the goose flesh breaking out over his body. Perhaps Gu Yuan could understand his affection, but he would never understand his desire. Chang Geng heard the splashing of water as Gu Yuan climbed ashore and draped his robe back over his body. Sighing, Gu Yuan reached out and patted Chang Geng on the shoulder. You know that's not possible, he said, calmly skirting the question. The corner of Chang Geng's mouth curled slightly, as if he were about to smile, but in the end he failed. In a barely audible whisper, he said, I know. I won't make things difficult for Yifu. Gu Yuan sat down beside him. It was a long time before he finally found his composure. Just as he was about to open his mouth to speak, a fierce blast of wind lanced toward his back. The glass of wine that Chang Geng had set aside shone with a sharp light. Before Gu Yuan could react, Chang Geng had already lunged toward him. Pulling Gu Yuan into his embrace, Chang Geng rolled to the side, his arms tightening around the other man. At the same time, Gu Yuan's dog-like nose caught a whiff of blood. An arrow trailing white steam grazed Chang Geng, tearing through his long sleeve and lacerating the skin beneath. Chang Geng lifted his head and glimpsed the cold gleam of metal darting past the tranquil little courtyard outside. It was a figure in light pelt armor. The distance between the hot spring villa and the northern camp was less than 3 kilometers. Even without spurring a horse to full speed, it was possible to ride from one to the other in no time at all. Where did this assassin come from? The assassin's first strike failed to kill its target, but the danger wasn't over yet. As the sun sank heavily over the horizon, the man in light pelt armor leapt out from behind the courtyard wall on the other side. A blast of steam jetted from the armor's soles, and the assassin moved like a flash of lightning to arrive before them in an instant. Guyuan shoved Chang Geng aside and pulled his iron sword from beneath the little table on which they had set out their wine. With the flip of his wrist, he exchanged several rapid blows with the assassin. Guyuan's martial skills had been honed sparring barehanded with iron puppets in his childhood. He thought nothing of engaging a light armor burning violet gold. Yet, after a brief clash with the enemy, Guyuan retreated several steps. He was alarmed to find that his hands were shaking, and he struggled to lift the weight of his iron sword. One glance was all it took for Chang Geng to realize something was amiss and reached out to catch him. Grabbing Guyuan's wrist, Chang Geng guided his hands to viciously thrust the blade up through the assassin's throat with pinpoint accuracy. The tip of the sword pierced all the way through the assassin's head and struck the top of his iron helmet. There was a sharp clang, followed by a fine spray of bloody mist. Chang Geng spared not a single look toward the dead man, but immediately slid his fingers over Guyuan's inner wrist to check his pulse. "You've been drugged," he said in a low voice. Guyuan's chest felt numb, and his heart pounded erratically. He grunted in acknowledgement, struggling to catch his breath. As the numbness spread through the rest of his limbs, the deaf and blind Guyuan became tense with unease. "I'm fine." Guyuan sucked in several quick breaths. "The attack might not be over yet. Guyuan's crow's beak hadn't even completed its premonition before a dozen light pelts vaulted over the courtyard walls. At the same time, startled by the disturbance, the Marquis's guards standing watch outside rose in response. Perhaps there was something wrong with these assassins' heads. Their assassination attempt had failed, yet they refused to back down. They swarmed forward to engage the guards, as if eager to die. The household retainers of the Marquis estate were all former soldiers who had retired from the battlefield. They were a different breed from the hired thugs usually employed to protect the homes of wealthy families. These guards were highly disciplined and mobilized with speed and efficiency. Seeing that the fight was now overwhelmingly one-sided, Chang Geng helped Guyuan to the sidelines. "Yifu." Guyuan raised a finger to his lips. He patted Chang Geng on the shoulder and gently lifted Chang Geng's wounded arm, indicating that he should take care of himself first. Chang Geng ignored him. He knelt beside Guyuan and took him by the wrist. His pulse was already steadier than before. Chang Geng struggled to stay calm. He remembered that Guyuan had been abusing medicine for years, so he was more resistant to drugs than the average person. It wasn't so easy to knock him out. In all likelihood, the reason the drug had such a precipitous effect was because he'd been soaking in the hot water. An explosion suddenly reverberated across the courtyard, the whole villa trembling in its wake. Even the half-deaf Guyuan heard it. After a brief scuffle, the assassins had been subdued by the capable estate guards. Yet before the captain of the guard could apprehend them, every assassin ruptured the gold tanks on their armor and self-destructed. Guyuan narrowed his rather useless eyes and murmured under his breath, "A suicide attack." The captain of the guard ordered his men to put out the fire and hurried over to Guyuan. "Forgive this subordinate's incompetence. I ask that the Marquis and His Highness please evacuate first." Guyuan made no response. He seemed to be caught up in his own thoughts. Faded memories were dragged brutally to the surface of his heart. They bared their fangs viciously before his eyes, and brandished claws made only sharper by time. The wind whipping beyond the pass that year had been filled with killing intent. Everywhere he looked, there was black iron, and boundless, bleak grasslands stretched into the distance. A huge flock of vultures circled overhead. and horses cantered through the tall grass, every few steps kicking up chunks of white bones scored by the teeth of wild beasts. Little Guyuan, whose head barely cleared the top of a writing desk, was currently being disciplined by the old Marquis for some minor infraction. He'd been forbidden from eating breakfast and was now holding a horse stance in the middle of the camp as punishment. The soldiers that walked by couldn't help but snigger when they saw him. The boy had been excessively proud since he was very young, and the soldiers' laughter made his eyes swim with tears, but he stubbornly refused to let them fall. By then, the fighting on the border had abated. The 18 tribes' tribute of violet gold had been delivered to the national treasury, and their goddess had been conferred the title of noble consort. Everything had been peaceful. Without warning, a heavy armored soldier on patrol collapsed next to Guyuan. Every guard in his courtyard followed suit, crumbling one by one where they stood. The sound of thunderous battle cries reached him from outside the walls. Little Guyuan had never seen combat before. Petrified, he instinctively cast about for a weapon. But he was only a child. Even if he used both hands, he couldn't lift even the lightest of swords. The attackers who stormed the camp that day had also been a suicide squad, their movements swift as the wind as they rushed forth like demons or deities. Guyuan had watched as a soldier who had laughed at him only minutes ago began to struggle like a dying bird, resolutely shielding the young Guyuan beneath his body. Even now, Guyuan remembered that sea of carnage, how he had looked on helplessly as those soldiers were cut down one by one in their own camp like livestock awaiting slaughter. Something had struck him in the back, and the pain was unbearable, but the pain was soon replaced by numbness. Little by little, his body began to feel like it had been severed from his mind. The din around him faded, and what little consciousness he retained seemed to be trapped alongside his heart as it nearly beat through his chest. He couldn't breathe. In this half-conscious daze, he had heard such an earth-shattering explosion. This was the moment the princess arrived with reinforcements, and those intruders self-destructed their light armor. Chang Geng pressed down on his shoulder. Yifu! Guyuan's glassy eyes finally refocused. Is there a wolf head tattoo on the unburnt corpses? He murmured. What? Chang Geng asked. The captain of the guard flinched in surprise, then jerked his head up. The Gu estate's guards remembered that incident even more clearly than their master, who had still been so young back then. The Marquis is saying, check after you extinguish the fire, Guyuan said, expressionless, and find the person who drugged me. Guyuan could feel the drug's effects fading as he spoke. He walked forward in a daze. His glass monocle had shattered when it tumbled to the ground in the earlier chaos. He could barely see where he was going and almost stepped right into the hot spring. Chang Geng lurched to his feet, uncharacteristically clumsy. He wrapped his arm protectively around Guyuan's back without so much as a by your leave and led him all the way across the courtyard. So lost was Guyuan in his thoughts that he didn't even push him away. Chang Geng helped him into the room and laid a thin blanket over his shoulder. He was about to check his pulse when Guyuan finally spoke. Bring me my medicine. Chang Geng frowned. No, you're still... Guyuan's face went blank. I said, bring me my medicine, he repeated, more insistent this time. Chang Geng stared at him in surprise. He could sense that Guyuan's temper had begun to spark. Although his face remained impassive, a viciousness slowly revealed itself as the brutality of a million suits of iron armor coalesced in his unseeing eyes. For an instant, that delicately handsome man seemed like a demonic fiend roused from slumber. But it was only for an instant. Guyuan soon came to his senses, and his expression softened. He fumbled about slightly for Chang Geng's arm, then patted him on the hand. Go get your wound treated first. When you're done, help me prepare a dose of my medicine. What happened to listening to me, Chang Geng fell silent for a spell. Then he turned to leave, slamming his fist against the pillar by the door on his way out. At that moment, a still more violent storm was sweeping toward the capital city's sea of lights. That night, in a house off the narrow lane in the legation quarter, a beardless old man with thinning hair took one last look at the blood letter sitting on the table. He hung himself from the rafters, ending his ailing life as the first glimmers of dawn stole over the capital. In his agitated state, Guyuan had forgotten to instruct the captain of the guard to keep the attack under wraps. The hot spring villa and the northern camp were practically neighbors. Word of this incident flew from one to the other as swiftly as if it had sprouted wings. Tan Hongfei, the commander of the northern camp, was the former member of the Black Iron Battalion who had campaigned with the old Marquis in the north. When he received word that his own commanding officer had met with the assassination attempt in the heart of the empire, right under his nose, he flew into a rage. He personally led a contingent of soldiers to investigate the incident. It was impossible to conceal such a dramatic move, and in no time at all, news of the attempt on Guyuan's life in the capital outskirts had spread like wildfire. But this was only the beginning. By the time Guyuan recovered the use of his eyes and ears the next day and remembered his oversight, it was too late. Tan Hongfei had already led his troops into the capital to browbeat the harried capital magistrate into investigating suspicious out-of-towners. As for the herald sent to chase down Tan Hongfei with Guyuan's orders, he had hardly dismounted from his horse when an unknown individual carrying a blood letter arrived to strike the drum. Guyuan's herald didn't dare barge into the capital magistrate's office without permission. He hastily sent someone to bring word of his arrival, unaware that the place had already become as chaotic as a bubbling pot of porridge. He waited long enough to burn through a full stick of incense before someone from the magistrate's office finally led him inside to deliver his message. Before he could make a sound, Tan Hongfei, commander of the northern camp, had risen to his feet with a ferocious glare and slapped the writing table before him with such a force that it cracked. Magistrate Zhu, the capital magistrate, was frightened so badly his black gauze official's hat slipped and hung crookedly from his head. "Who the hell are you? Say that again!" Tan Hongfei barked at the man before them. The middle-aged man holding the letter spoke slowly and distinctively. "This lowly subject is the owner of a pastry shop located just outside the eastern legation quarter. My adoptive father was once known as Wu He Gonggong, imperial eunuch and keeper of seals of the late Yuan He emperor. Many years ago, to avoid prosecution, he faked his death and was lucky enough to escape the imperial palace. He has been living in secret among the common people all this time. He never expected, after more than a dozen years, to be discovered by treacherous individuals. Last night, he committed suicide to avoid implicating his family. This lowly subject's life is as brief as a firefly's glow and as insignificant as decaying grass, so lacking in value that is not worth mentioning. However, in light of my late father's death, I feel compelled to expose this great injustice to the world." Capital Magistrate Zhu Heng immediately sensed the profound ramifications of the case before them. He promptly cried, "Impudent miscreant! What nonsense! The imperial eunuch Wu He was imprisoned and sentenced to death by waist chop for his crime of conspiring to murder the imperial prince. Are you accusing the imperial court of judicial review of mishandling this case?" The man fell to his knees and knocked his head against the ground. "This lowly subject holds a blood letter written by my father minutes before his death. Today, I lay my neck on the line for this audience with you, Your Honor. How would I dare speak a single word of falsehood?" Back then, the imperial eunuch Wu He seemed to have been taken by a fit of madness. He had accepted bribes and conspired with the disfavored imperial concubine to murder the third prince. The uproar that followed the scandal had touched even the young Guyuan, who had still resided within the imperial palace at the time. Because of this, former members of the Black Iron Battalion had dearly wished to chop that ignorant eunuch to pieces with their own hands. Tan Hongfei's expression was dark. "Magistrate Zhu, there's no harm in hearing him out." Guyuan's instructions had been clear. Do not, under any circumstances, allow Tan Hongfei to cause trouble. Sensing the situation was taking a dangerous turn, the herald made a quick decision. General Tan, he interjected. The Marquis asks that you return to the northern camp at once. That's right, Zhu Heng said hastily. General Tan, please return to the northern camp. If there is any news regarding those foreign scoundrels, this lowly official will send someone to notify you at once. The complainant kneeling below the dais raised his voice. This lowly subject brings suit against the late Yuanhe Emperor for the crime of falling for the barbarian enchantress's deceptions and conspiring to poison his loyal subject. Chapter 55. Conflagration. Everyone was stunned. Only after a long silence did the herald once again recall the purpose of his visit. General Tan, he said hoarsely. The Marquis, shut up, Tan Hongfei thundered. His glaring bull's eyes gleamed like bronze bells as he turned toward the man kneeling in the center of the hall. Tan Hongfei's throat felt tight, and the hair on his body seemed to shudder and stand on end. What did you say? Speak clearly. Which loyal subject? The man straightened up. His complexion was sallow. He seemed rather pitiful, yet as he spoke, his face was filled with an indescribable conviction. 20 years ago, the grasslands of the northern barbarians were beset by natural disasters, and the ambitious Wolf King raised troops and invaded our nation. The former Marquis of Order led the Black Iron Battalion to pacify the northern border and force the Wolf Pack's surrender. In addition to the annual tributes, the barbarian goddess and her younger sister were sent to our imperial court as a peace offering. The Yuanhe Emperor took the elder sister as his consort. As for the younger sister, he bestowed upon her the title of Commandery Princess and brought her into the palace as an attendant, no doubt intending to marry her off to a member of the imperial family. No one expected that pair of wicked enchantresses to harbor malice in their hearts and conspire against the nation. The sisters fabricated correspondence between the former Marquis and the Wolf King. They framed the former Marquis, making it look like he'd threatened the 18 tribes after the treaty was signed, extorting violet gold for his own private use. They then used their sorcery to bewitch the emperor, driving the wedge between sovereign and subject deeper with each passing day. Before he could say another word, Magistrate Zhu exploded with fury. Guards! This lying scoundrel is slandering His Majesty! Arrest him! Tan Hongfei's eyes were about to burst from their sockets with the intensity of his glare. Any who try will answer to me. At his roar, the northern camp soldiers at his side drew their weapons. Silver armor flashed as they lined up behind their commander in a neat row, swords gleaming bright as snow. The ferocious beasts engraved on their blade hilts snarled as if about to spring forward and tear into their enemies. The color drained from Zhu Heng's face. He was a scholar, not a soldier. He braced himself with what little courage he had. Voice trembling, he asked, Tan Hongfei, are you trying to start an insurrection? Tan Hongfei sneered. He strode down the stone steps toward the man, stood before him, and thrust his saber into the ground where the blade stood like a great iron tower. Go on, he demanded. What happened next? I wonder whether the general remembers, the man said. Back then, the young Marquis was only a child. No one in the Marquis estate could control him, so once the fighting in the border region subsided, the Marquis and the princess brought him to the military encampment. Tan Hongfei's eyes flickered. He was swept up in the old memories by this handful of words. He remembered. The glorious Marshal Gu had once been a hellion of a child. He feared no one and got himself into all manner of mischief. Neither the former Marquis nor the princess had parents or elders who could look after or discipline him in their stead. Seeing that the child would become absolutely lawless if no one took him in hand, they had no choice but to bring the boy with them. Tan Hongfei nodded slowly. Yes, it's as you say. The enchantress exploited the situation, the man continued. She insinuated that the former Marquis took his son only from the capital because he was plotting treason. Perhaps he was planning to rend a great tract of land from the body of Great Liang and found his own nation in the west. Spellbound, His Majesty the Yuanhe Emperor grew increasingly acrimonious toward the former Marquis. At the same time, he feared the Black Iron Battalion, a force capable of annihilating the barbarians with only 30 armed cavalry. He didn't know what to do. Preposterous! Tan Hongfei exclaimed. The man's face remained unmoved, his voice steady. The enchantress devised a vicious plot with the help of another villain. They tasked my late father, Wu Gonggong, with leading 30 suicide fighters and 2 individuals with unusual talents to the northern border. Their ostensible purpose was to reward the troops stationed on the front line, but their true mission was to infiltrate the garrison and carry out the assassination. To prevent the plot from being exposed in the event of failure, the suicide fighters tattooed wolf heads on their chests to disguise themselves as barbarians. Tan Hongfei's breathing grew heavy. He had been there, back then. 30 barbarian suicide fighters had snuck into the northern border garrison. Their attack had come without warning, as if the warriors fell from the sky. The enemy used an underhanded tactic and dosed the soldiers' food and drink with paralytic powder. Then they donned black iron light pelt armor and rose from inside the soldiers' own ranks. The garrison soldiers were accustomed to seeing light pelt armor going to and fro every day while on patrol. When it happened, they were completely defenseless. "That's right," Tan Hongfei mumbled. "Everything you've said matches what happened that day. I was just a lowly squadron commander back then. There were indeed only 30 light pelt suicide fighters." The former Marquis had used 30 suits of heavy armor to decimate the 18 tribes. Thus, the enchantress sent him 30 light pelts to turn the invincible Black Iron Battalion upside down and wound the Marquis of Anding's sole heir. A low chuckle escaped Tan Hongfei's throat. That was the Black Iron Battalion's greatest and most humiliating shame. The former Marquis happened to be out on patrol at the time, and Her Highness the Princess woke up that morning feeling indisposed and couldn't keep anything down. Otherwise, the young Marquis wouldn't have been the only one wounded that day. Isn't that right? The commander of the northern camp had stabbed his great saber into the ground so violently that a crack had formed in the thick stone flooring. In her fury, the princess became convinced that there were enemies within our ranks. There were a dozen or so of us brothers responsible for the northern border garrison's defense. Our position was suspicious. We could not absolve ourselves of blame. We had no choice but to shed our armor, step down from our posts, and return to the capital one by one to accept punishment. After all these years, I've privately resented Her Highness. I thought she had lost her mind from distress for her beloved son, when in reality she was right. Tears streamed from Tan Hongfei's eyes. He didn't bother to wipe them, nor did he sob aloud. He remained standing, as rigid as his towering iron sword, gasping as if he was in excruciating pain. Zhu Heng was stunned by the sight. It was like seeing tears on the grim face of the king of hell. For a moment, the swollen anger in his heart was punctured by Tan Hongfei's tears and released a thin stream of air. The capital magistrate couldn't help but soften his voice as he addressed him. "This is a very serious matter. It would be unjust to rely solely on this man's one-sided testimony. General Tan, please proceed with caution." Tan Hongfei came back to his senses, but truthfully, he already believed most of the man's tale. As the one in command of the northern border garrison's defense at the time, no one knew better than he how impregnable the Black Iron Battalion had been. Over the years, Guyuan had always treated the former members of the Black Iron Battalion with kindness and generosity. He had even supported Tan Hongfei's promotion to commander of the northern camp. But Tan Hongfei never forgot that on his back he carried the wrongful conviction of dereliction of duty, which he had no way to appeal. Tan Hongfei shot Zhu Heng a glance. He gritted his teeth and leaned down to question the complainant before him. "Indeed. What evidence do you have?" The man pulled the blood letter from his lapels, then prostrated himself again. "This letter was written by my late father's own hand. His body lies outside the door as we speak. If the general examines him, he will recognize him as Wu He and know that all I have said is true." Zhu Heng frowned, but Tan Hongfei had already ordered his men to bring in the corpse. A few minutes later, a dried-up husk of man was carried in. This hanged ghost was not at all resting in peace. Its cheeks were swollen, and its tongue protruded from its mouth, its throat bruised as purple as a malevolent spirit. Tan Hong Fei took only one look before diverting his gaze as if unable to bear such a burden. "I remember there was a triangular scar at the corner of the old eunuch's eye," he said, voice rough. The middle-aged man crawled forward on his knees. He carefully turned the corpse's face upward and pushed aside its withered white hair. There, covered in wrinkles and age spots, yet clearly visible at the corner of the dead man's eye, was an old triangular scar. Silence descended upon the room. Ju Hung's face drained of all blood, and he inhaled sharply. His shaking, scholarly hands reached up to straighten the official's hat that had been knocked askew by Tan Hong Fei's earlier slap. "And then what happened?" "Luckily, the heavens help those who are worthy," the man below the dais responded. "The young marquis escaped calamity. As time passed, the late emperor awakened from the enchantress's sorcery. He deeply regretted what happened and secretly punished the barbarian enchantress and her sister. At the same time, he treated the young marquis with greater favor than ever before, bringing him in the imperial palace and personally taking charge of his care. But although the enchantress was executed, the villain who first presented that vicious plot to his majesty remained at large. A few years later, fearing that the Gu family was once again growing in influence, this person colluded with Wu He Gong and set his sights on the young marquis once again." Ju Hung's face was dark as an overcast sky. "Matters concerning the imperial harem are not to be discussed in public. Think carefully before you speak." The middle-aged man's laughter rang loudly through the hall. "Many thanks, Your Honor. This lowly subject grew up in a farming family on the northern border. For generations, my family suffered at the hands of the barbarians. My father, mother, and brothers all died under the swords of those fiends and their phony sorcery. It was the former marquis who saved our lives and gave us satisfaction for our anger. I am but a commoner, a lowly man of ignoble status who has endured in silence for many years. I waited upon the old eunuch all this time, not for the sake of any inheritance or privilege, but for the arrival of this day." Tan Hong Fei was nearly numb, without even the energy to cry anymore. "But I remember the one who died that year was His Highness the Third Prince." "That's right," the man agreed. "Wu He employed a poison that dispersed through the air when heated and applied it to the gas lamp the young marquis used to study. Wu He said that as a child, the young marquis liked to crank the gas lamp up to its brightest setting, and he would often leave it lit even when he retired to bed. After burning all night, the lamp would be hot enough to fry an egg. Naturally, the poison would vaporize and diffuse through the air and be inhaled. The young marquis would first be afflicted with a lingering cough and persistent low fevers, ailments common in young children, nothing that would arouse suspicion. But over time, his body would gradually weaken until the poison reached his vital organs, at which point it would be too late for any treatment to save him." Tan Hong Fei's eyes were so red they were on the verge of dripping blood. The young marquis's gas lamp was a special tribute from the far west. It had a lampshade fashioned from colored glass and was terribly precious. The lamps were presented only to the imperial princess and the young marquis. Not even the empress received one. However, the third prince accidentally broke his gas lamp. He feared he would be scolded and didn't dare ask anyone else for help, so the young marquis exchanged lamps with him. The marquis secretly glued the shattered pieces of the prince's broken lamp back together and covered it with a book every day, pretending to use it as usual. We all know the rest of the story. The third prince was poisoned and died young. The late emperor was furious and turned the imperial harem inside out, and Wu He was imprisoned for plotting against the life of the imperial prince. Thus, the eunuch became a scapegoat for the crafty man in the shadows. The man prostrated himself on the ground once more with a flip of his sleeves. "Now, the entire sequence of events has been laid before you," he said in a ringing voice. "My sincere thanks to all the lords and generals present. As for that crafty and fawning villain who walks free to this day, he is none other than the imperial uncle Wang Guo. Insolence! How dare you? Zhu Heng stammered, dumbstruck. I have no attachment to this insignificant body of flesh. I dare to be insolent, the man cried. What evidence do you have? Zhu Heng pressed. The man pulled out a tattered letter, so old its edges had begun to curl. Your Honor, this is a letter that Imperial Uncle Wang penned with his own hand as he conducted his secret dealings with the Imperial eunuch. As for its authenticity, you will know at a glance. The man set the letter on the ground. He tilted his head back slightly and seemed to sigh. With this, the grievances of the past have been settled. By the time Tan Hongfei noticed the queerness of his expression, it was too late. The man rose quickly to his feet and, before anyone could react, turned and slammed his head into a pillar. Blood and brain matter splattered the ground. The man died on the spot, clearly a suicide fighter of a different kind. Back in the hot spring villa, Guyuan's eyelid inexplicably began to twitch. Huo Dan, the captain of the Marquis Estate's guards, burst into his room, his whole body heaving for breath. My lord. Guyuan's head whipped around. What is it? Captain Huo's heart had been pounding wildly since the moment he received word of the disturbance in the capital. But before he could open his mouth to report, the door was flung open once more. In the doorway stood Chang Geng, a wooden bird, beak open wide and wings outstretched, clutched in his hand. The little creature's head had been unceremoniously detached. Chang Geng had crushed its solid wooden body in his grip. The jagged edges of the exposed gears stabbed into his palms and left a bloody mess behind. But he seemed not to register the pain. He was like a fish ripped from the water, gasping for air, yet his chest couldn't hold even a single breath. Clenched in his other hand was a blood-stained piece of billow paper. The wooden bird was faster than a carriage or horse. After all, someone had already sent him news of the farce in the capital. Chang Geng felt as though there were a blade pressed to his sternum, as if blood would seep out with every rise and fall of his chest. He stumbled over to Guyuan and enfolded him in his arms. Captain Huo, who had been standing to the side, started in surprise. My lord. Guyuan waved him toward the door. Old Huo, step out for a minute. Captain Huo's throat bobbed slightly. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he quietly withdrew. This unfortunate child was surprisingly strong. Guyuan felt as if his waist was about to snap in two from the force of his embrace. Once Captain Huo was gone, he freed one of his hands and patted Chang Geng on the back. What's wrong? Chang Geng dropped his head and buried his face in Guyuan's shoulder. The medicinal fragrance that clung to Guyuan's body lingered all around him. Chang Geng used to find the scent soothing, even in his dreams. It had the power to dispel the shadowy haze of his nightmares. Yet in this moment, he never wanted to smell the fragrance of medicine on Guyuan's body again. Chang Geng closed his eyes, his ears roared, and a single thought was stark in his mind. I'm going to slaughter every last member of the Li family. Ooh. Guyuan extracted the crumbled piece of billow paper from his hand and skimmed it from top to bottom. He inhaled sharply and shoved Chang Geng away. Huo Dan, he shouted as he stood, furious. Captain Huo had been waiting by the door and promptly re-entered at his call. Guyuan felt like he was going mad. He'd risen too quickly to his feet, and for a second his vision darkened at the edges. He hastily leaned against the table, his arms shaking nonstop. Ready my horse. I'm returning to the capital. Guyuan sucked in a deep breath. Take... His voice cracked, but he harshly cleared his throat and continued. Take a few light pelts and move out first. You must stop Tan Hongfei at all costs. Captain Huo shot him a searching look. Yes, sir. Guyuan had already turned to fetch his court robes and light armor when his wrist was caught by Chang Geng. Is it true? Chang Geng asked, his voice trembling. Gu Yuan dipped his head and gazed at him, his eyes filled with a roiling tempest of emotions. After a brief pause, he said in a low voice, "Of course not. There's no such thing as sorcery, and Imperial Wang is merely a subservient dog of the imperial throne who attacked where he was pointed. As for the two barbarian women, they were pitiful figures who had been surrendered to a far and foreign land in the wake of their nation's defeat. Everyone knew the truth, but no one dared to say it aloud." Gu Yuan yanked his hand out of Chang Geng's grasp. "The situation is tumultuous right now. Keep away from the capital for the time being and stay here for a few days." But Chang Geng would not be put off. "So, aside from the sorcery in Wangguo, everything else is true? You know? You've always known?" Gu Yuan was out of patience. "This isn't the time. Don't stir up any more trouble. Step aside." Chang Geng spoke over him. "Why do you still exhaust yourself for him to protect this rotten nation? Why do you concede so much ground? Why did you take me in and care for me for so many years?" he finally asked quietly. Chang Geng's voice was soft as fallen snow, so weak it was barely audible over Gu Yuan's furious shout. Yet somehow, the instant these words escaped him, they flew unerringly to the ears of the one who needed to hear them. Gu Yuan's heart constricted. Chang Geng's lips were bloodless. His eyes bored into Gu Yuan as he asked again, "Why, Yifu?" Gu Yuan's throat bobbed. He didn't know where to begin. What should he say? Should he say that back then he had no idea? That for years he assumed his wound had been nothing more than an accident? That he thought it had been he who failed to protect Yan? That he had looked on helplessly as the little prince died, a victim of vicious struggles within the imperial harem? That not until he was ordered to escort Crown Prince Jialai Yinghua beyond the pass did he learn from the barbarian's own malicious mouth that the poison of the grassland's goddess was a closely guarded secret, that it had remained the sole knowledge of the goddess for generations, that even members of the same tribe could not reproduce it, and so the 30 light cavalrymen who carried that poison and inflicted such heavy casualties on the Black Iron Battalion 20 years ago absolutely could not have been sent by any barbarians in the north? Home and country, enmity and resentment. The road of life was wide enough that anyone could make their own way without impeding others' paths. But no matter what direction one chose, the moment they took that very first step, they would never be able to turn back. These affairs encompassed so many things that weren't fit to be spoken. In the end, Gu Yuan said nothing. He pried open Chang Geng's hand, donned his armor, and tied up his hair. The general had a heart. What a pity it was cast from iron. Gu Yuan's reaction was hardly slow, and the 100 Marquis Estate guards could hardly be considered ineffective. But they were still too late. By the time Huodan, drenched in cold sweat, reached the capital's city walls, the northern camp had risen in mutiny. The Imperial Guard had mobilized to deal with the crisis. The 9 city gates were sealed, and the capital descended into chaos. Wow! Oh my God, the calamity! Man, there's so much to unpack here. I don't even know where to start. So I guess I'll just look at my little notes that I have, which I eventually stopped taking. I just wanted to let you guys know, for anyone that did not know, Chapter 53's title, Détente, means relaxation or release from tension. And that, of course, is, if you couldn't tell, a French word. Dun-dee-dee! So the first thing I want to say is, number one, I am super proud of Chang Geng for how bold he was at the hot spring. Like, don't get me wrong, it may not have turned out the way he wanted it to, or even me, because my feelings were like, oh, like I was hurting so hard for him. But I was proud of him for going ahead and being real and expressing to Gu Yuan how he feels for him. Even after Gu Yuan gave his whole speech of basically like, you'll get over this, Chang Geng was basically like, no, sir. No, sir, no, I'm not. And let me just go ahead and make you aware of how serious my feelings are for you. I applaud him so very much. But like I said, I'm not gonna lie. It did hurt my heart to see Gu Yuan respond the way he did. I was like, oh, he doesn't like him back. But I mean, of course, at this moment, I know logically, Why would he? Even if he's had a couple of thoughts here and there about Chang Geng and his handsomeness or his character or this or that, how he'd make the perfect housewife or wife-ish, I understand, but at the same time, I was just kind of like, oh. Also, even though it kind of all built up in this final chapter here, I was very happy to finally get more details on how Gu Yuan's eyes and ears became the way that they are. And it's just so sucky because you find this pretty much in any ancient Chinese plot, whether it's in Danmei regular books or in their C-dramas, where the emperor has his most trusted, military servant, yet at the same time, they fear the hell out of them and think that they're going to start a rebellion or turn on them or something. And so they end up treating them badly or doing something to them that honestly could stir the person to want to rebel, But usually the military people are so loyal, They're not going to turn, and it's just the emperor being paranoid. And it's like, on one hand, I totally get it, especially in the case of Sha Pulang and the things that have transpired within Gu Yuan's life. Like Shun Yi said, they tried to destroy you. So I totally get them fearing like, oh my gosh, would Gu Yuan try to turn around and, get his revenge? But like it was said multiple times throughout this story, people will judge you by their own standards, essentially, what they would do if they were in someone else's shoes. But yeah, it's pretty crazy just to know how all of that stuff turned out and getting a little bit more backstory. And I'm scared. I'm like, oh gosh, what's about to happen next? Because General, who was it again? Hold on. Oh yeah, Commander Tan Hongfei. Woo! Once he heard that story, he was like, oh no, we about to start a fight. That's not funny. But anyway, stuff just got really, really interesting. I mean, this whole story has been interesting, but now I feel like we're really getting some more like meat on the bones of this story, and it's so freaking exciting. I'm telling you guys, I really dislike politics so freaking much. If you ask me a single thing about American politics, I'm gonna be like, nani? Shema? Ke? What, in every language that I could possibly speak. But when it comes to I'm sorry for laughing. When it comes to political plots in Danmei or in C-dramas in general, for some reason, they really, really excite me. And this is exciting. Are you excited? Oh my God, I need to go. I will see you all next time when we start Arc 7, A Nation in Crisis. Because right now I'm having my own beloved crisis. So, have a great day or night, and wo爱你们.